This is American Community Media Zoom News Briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor at ACOM, and your moderator for today. We had originally planned this briefing to examine the escalation of U.S. military presence and threats toward Venezuela, including maritime operations, seizures, and mounting pressure. But as you know, a few days ago, the facts on the ground changed dramatically. Following direct U.S. military action and the removal of Venezuela's ruler, Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela has entered a new and deeply uncertain phase. What was already a long and painful political crisis has now shifted into an open-ended transition whose outcome remains unclear. We are honored to be joined by three experts who will help us unpack these issues from different perspectives. We invite reporters to post their questions in the chat. We will take questions from reporters immediately after each speaker presents, and we will send video and follow-up materials after today's briefing. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our simultaneous interpreters in Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. Our panelists today are Mariano de Alba. He's a Venezuelan lawyer, expert in geopolitics, international law, and diplomacy. Alejandro Velasco, he's a professor at the Gallatin School at the Department of History at New York University and executive editor of the NACLA Report on the Americas. And Roxana Vigil, she's an international affairs fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So again, like I said before we start, I have something to ask you. Please listen to the speakers before you post a question in the chat. And that way the chat won't be inundated with questions that may be answered by the speakers. So let's begin with Alejandro Velasco, historian at New York University's Gallatin School at the Department of History and executive editor of the NACLA Report on the Americas. Alejandro, I'd like to start with you analyzing what we know to be happening inside Venezuela. I will ask two questions for you to touch on what you can. So one question is, after years of political crisis and institutional erosion, how might Venezuelans themselves be interpreting this moment following the removal of the country's president through military action, but leaving the regime in charge? And the second thing I wanted to touch on is, given the depth of economic collapse and institutional damage in Venezuela, what would actually be required for a credible and inclusive democratic recovery? What conditions would need to exist, and how far are we from them right now? Please go ahead, Alejandro. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, well, let me see what I can do with those two very large questions. I should say that I'm the former editor from NACLA. There's an entire wonderful new team that's in there now, but so first of all, thank you so much for having me and for this opportunity. It's really great to speak to this particular audience, and thank all of you for your interest in Venezuela and for covering this really important story. As I'm a Venezuelan and have family and friends in Venezuela, it's sort of a kind of, my career has been kind of in these two tracks of trying to analyze it in as objective a way as possible, giving my analytical tools as an historian. But then also, of course, having a very personal stake in what happens. And so, given that, to your first question, I mean, from the folks that I've spoken with on the ground, I'd say that there's three major kind of, both emotions as well as just thinking about what's going on right now. The first one is just anxiety, precisely as you suggested, about a future that, even though, of course, as you all have noted, the crises that have really enveloped Venezuela, not only over the last few years, but really going back decades in various ways, have now entered an entirely new phase. The idea that the United States has actually taken direct military intervention into the country, and now possibly this sort of intervention through extortion or through pressure, or whatever you call it, that very dramatically shifts the landscape of political opportunities, risks, and constraints of the various actors, and then, of course, of the daily lives of Venezuelans themselves. So anxiety, I think, is a pretty broad, general, pervasive feeling. The other one is confusion, right? As dramatic as the events on Saturday were, as you noted, functionally, nothing really has changed in terms of the players who are in power, with, of course, the major and significant exception being Maduro, right? And so there's a sense of, as both painful and frightening and jarring, shocking, whatever term you want to use, as Saturday was, what actually has changed since, right? And so that's another significant sense of sort of pervasive confusion that I've heard from friends and family. But the other one, and this has been manifesting somewhat as the dust, both literal and figurative, has settled over the past few days, I should say, and I'm eager to hear what my fellow speakers will say about this. There's also this strange sense of expectativa, which would be more like obviously not hope, but a sense of like, well, the game seems to be unstuck. Está estrancado el juego. Really when things seem to be happening, opportunities seem to be opened up. Like, for instance, just yesterday, significant release political prisoners happened. Which is
Alejandro, do you know why? There's like the problem, audio issues on whose side? On his side?
Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we can hear. There was a maybe you will have to turn off the camera. Yes. Okay.
Repeat that.
Okay. Which,
yeah, please repeat.
Can you tell me where we stopped hearing? I'm sorry, say that one more.
Your third point, as the dust has settled, there's this strange.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, and the third kind of.
Sandy, stop. Okay.
So the third kind of overwhelming, not overwhelming, but very incipient sense that I'm getting from, again, folks on the ground is saying the word expectativa, which is, certainly doesn't translate to hope, but a sense that a political game, and by game here, I mean, not in terms of play, but rather in terms of like game theory, has been unstuck. Está estrancado after, so long of seeing no movement, and the only movement being towards greater pressure. And we've seen things happening that I think seemed completely implausible, even days and certainly months ago, like the release of political prisoners, which we began to see last night. Very conciliatory messaging coming out of the new authorities in Venezuela about working with the Trump administration. Even the Trump himself saying that perhaps there might be a meeting, or perhaps I might even go to Venezuela. And so these are things that were unthinkable just a few weeks and months ago. And so that has added to that sense of anxiety, confusion, and now possibility, I suppose, among Venezuelans, which speaks, I think, to your second question, which is how has in what ways has the institutional landscape in Venezuela both contributed to and also shaped the sense of possibilities and opportunities for instance, a democratic transition in Venezuela. And on that point, I think that remains, to me at least, the primary question. It seems, at least from what we've heard on the part of the US administration, that for them, democracy is not a secondary, not a tertiary, who knows how far down the list, a concern or an aim or an aspiration for this particular moment in Venezuela. The center really does seem to be, at least on the surface, oil, but more broadly, there is a larger geopolitical dimension to this, which is not just hegemony, but really domination of the region vis-a-vis its resources. And we see this in the context of, continuing threats on Greenland and, mounting conversation from people like Stephen Miller about, other resources in the continent actually, having to be dispatched explicitly to the United States, right? And so, we're seeing not just Venezuela and what's happening in Venezuela, but really Venezuela as a kind of as an instrumental piece in what seems to be emerging as a much larger geopolitical move on the part of the United States. So at least in terms of the U.S., the prospects for a democratic transition seem not to be very much part of the agenda. Now, what that means, of course, in the case of Venezuela is, and you mentioned, Pilar, I think you used the term institutional erosion. And I guess I would caution that, or perhaps nuance that, to say that in some ways, what we've seen over the past few days has been evidence of this, that there's a kind of paradox when we think about and talk about Venezuela. On the one hand, of course, there's crisis, economic, political tension, etc., which gives a sense of chaos. But on the other hand, actually, the regime itself is very, very cohesive. Obviously, the where Maduro has ended up might suggest differently, but in terms of statecraft, right, in terms of institutions and control of the state, right, that actually is not eroded per se. The way that we think about institutions as being representative, as being able to channel pluralist of the world, the way that they are able to distribute resources of the state, in ways that are not partisan in nature, of course, yes, that is completely eroded. But in terms of the solidity of the state, right, that is in fact the primary leverage that the new government in Venezuela has vis-a-vis the United States to say, if you had bet on a complete regime change with primarily an expatriate opposition led by Maria Corina Machado and her proxy, Edmundo Gonzalez, to come in and to undo Iraq war, the entire apparatus of the state. What you would have is actual chaos in the streets. You would have no police forces. You would have, paramilitary colectivos roaming the streets. You would have boots on the ground who would be easy targets, for insurgents or others in Venezuela. Instead, what we can offer you precisely is a state, right? That in now these various players in Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, her brother, Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of Interior, and Vladimir Lopez Padrino, the defense minister, can, because they have their own stake in remaining in power, use and deploy to provide stability in this transition moment. And this is the last point I'll make, I think, to your point, your question about the prospects for a democratic transition create both obviously a massive risk for people like Delcy Rodriguez in particular, but also importantly, a tremendous opportunity, because as you well noted, one of the primary concerns among Venezuelans on the ground, and also their relatives abroad, especially if those who have left more recently and primarily belong to working class, poor class sectors of the country, one of their primary concerns is economic viability, right? And just the daily life of being able to, exist in ways that, you can feed your family, you can feed your children, you can take them to school, you can have medicine, et cetera, without so much penury or conflict. And so what they are able to do now, which is to say Delcy Rodriguez and the people around her, is if they negotiate with the United States, actually perhaps incur very significant, at least significantly felt economic recovery in a pretty short period of time, which could translate and parlay into, and this is the most significant potential irony of the present moment, political capital that if, for instance, elections extend further into the future, potential, say, 12 to 18 months, they could potentially then turn that political capital into the most improbable scenario, which is a post-transition electoral victory, right? Especially if you consider what I think has been a kind of very weakened position on the part of the expat-led opposition by Maria Corina Machado, especially around support for not just the ouster of Maduro, but for U.S. intervention, which has created another cleavage among what's already a highly polarized, political society in Venezuela. I'll leave it there.
Let me ask you this, Alejandro. I read somewhere, I can't remember where, that Trump doesn't want a democratic Venezuela. He wants a useful Venezuela. And I was, as you all know, I'm also Venezuelan, so I've had a lot of feelings around this. I was shocked that President Trump, after a few hours after the operation, he essentially threw Maria Corina Machado under the bus. He said, "Oh, yeah, no, we're not thinking about her because she doesn't have the respect in the country." I mean, if you're going to have a democratic transition like you did in regimes in South America, like Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, many others, you need to have an international, you need to have a United States that is behind a democratic transition, and you need to have the international pressure and the international help. So far, what we see is that Trump seems to be focused on oil and whatever success he thinks this was. What's your feeling around this, Alejandro?
I mean, is it surprising that Donald Trump
No.
doesn't care about democracy? I mean,
No.
I'm not surprised about that, and perhaps
No, of
others
course
in,
not.
in the room might be. Am I surprised that his primary interest is material? No. I think what is surprising is the explicitness and the kind of brazenness with which this is being articulated. I mean, I'm an historian of Latin America, and in particular of modern Latin America, which is to say that I've studied, in U.S. interventions throughout the 20th century in Latin America. You mentioned a few of those. And I'm trained to read subtext. I'm trained to read between the lines. I'm trained to read past the blacked out parts of declassified documents, right? It is jarring to me as an historian, methodologically, to hear the quiet part stated so loudly, right? Like where before we need to say, well, let me tell you all the circumstances in which actually the United States is interested in this, that, and the other, as opposed to say principles of liberty, freedom, democracy, etc. It's really about these other things. Here, we're getting a very clear message about what the interests actually are. So if you see it in a very cold, calculated, principled way, which is, I think, the way we need to see it, then you can begin to imagine that in that context, Maria Corina Machado did not have, yes, she has significant amounts of popular standing, both outside and inside of Venezuela, as evidenced by the elections that the opposition won last year. But she does not, and this is true of what Donald Trump said, it's not that she doesn't have the respect of the population, of the people. She doesn't have the respect of the people that matter in a transition. And that's the people who have access to the institutions of the state, the police, the security forces, in this case, paramilitaries, courts, et cetera, like all of that matters. And not only does she not have the respect of them, but they very much see each other as existential enemies. And so, yeah, once you begin to see that, this is not a question of principles, it's really a question of more crass politics, then it absolutely makes sense that Maria Corina would have been sidelined.
Okay, so let's move on to the next speaker, and then we'll have more questions. Thank you so much, Alejandro. And now I want to invite Mariano de Alba, a Venezuelan lawyer specializing in geopolitics, international law, and diplomacy. Mariano, from a legal and diplomatic standpoint, like we said before, Venezuela faced the power vacuum, but now we have the VP of the same regime as president, all the other leadership, including Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabello, who is the power behind the throne. He's the man who has the paramilitary and the military in his hands, essentially. He is the power behind them. He's also indicted in the US, but he wasn't taken. He was left in power. What's your take on this? And then the other question is more broad, is What precedent does the use of military force to remove a government set under international law? How might this reshape norms around sovereignty and intervention beyond Venezuela?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Pilar. It's also a pleasure to share the panel with Roxana and Alejandro. I think that there are several things to consider here, right? From an international law perspective, I think it's quite clear that there's no legal way to justify this operation. There is a set of rules that were agreed after the Second World War in 1945. They are established very clearly in the UN Charter, and they establish not only a prohibition on the use of force, but also a prohibition on the threat of use of force, which is something that we have seen the US government doing on Venezuela for many months now, ending on this operation to capture and extract Nicolas Maduro from power. Obviously, that principle on the prohibition on the use of force has several exceptions. Namely, force can be used provided that there is one authorization from the UN Security Council, which in this case was always going to be impossible to obtain because of the veto of Russia and China. In ultimate instance, not impossible, I should say, very unlikely. And also, the force can be used in the case of exercising a legitimate right of self-defense. And I think that obviously that's somehow part of the reason why also I think that the Maduro government decided to, besides his dancings and his rhetoric, try to be very careful about how to respond to the massive military buildup in the Caribbean, right? Um, that's the international law angle of this, which obviously makes this operation illegal. Even though we also have to recognize that it is true that Nicolas Maduro could hardly be considered the legitimate president of the country, given that he lost resoundingly a presidential election in July 2024. However, that detail is irrelevant in terms of international law, given that Maduro, despite his lack of democratic legitimacy, which is totally true, he was at least de facto in control of the country. That's the international law angle. In terms of the U.S., view on this, we don't have to. I think it's not surprise to anyone that the U.S. has usually historically in after World War II has taken more or less, depending on who is in charge in the U.S. government, a sort of cherry picking approach to compliance with international law. It has tried to comply with international law, but in some instances, that has been a limit that the US doesn't want to respect. So in this case, I think that the US has put forward two arguments to basically to convince the US military that this was a lawful operation, or two or three arguments, I should say. First, the first one I already referred to, which is the fact of that the U.S. did not consider Maduro the president of Venezuela. Two, Maduro, since March 2020, he had an indictment basically approved by a jury in the U.S. Alleging that he has been involved for many years in narco trafficking, and that is basically the case that is going to now be litigated in U.S. courts. And third, I think that last year we also saw the U.S. Government trying to put forward a case which is sort of weak in legal terms, that puts forward the sorry, I'm so sorry about this. Give me 1 second. I'm so sorry. It's my daughter. I'm so sorry about this.
It's okay.
Mm.
It's okay.
So the U.S. Last year has put forward this argument that is, I would say two or threefold, right? It's that Maduro was the head of a drug trafficking organization called Cartel de los Soles, which is something that you might have heard, which that organization exists, but it's not an actual cartel as the ones that we know that operate in Mexico. It's more or less that name refers to the fact that it is true that Venezuela for many years has been a country where there is transit of drugs, and the narco traffickers have basically co-opted several people within the military and also the government, basically to turn a blind eye to that transit of drugs in exchange for money, right? So if one second, sorry.
Reminds me those candid videos where you see the
I'm so
babies
sorry about this.
going
Yeah.
into the room.
I'm so sorry, I got distracted. Also, I think that a very important issue here that we have to take into account is that President Trump saw this through a three-point angle, right? He saw this as oil, which has already been mentioned by Alejandro, drugs that I have been mentioning, but also I think it's very crucial, the migrants angle, right? And President Trump has put forward a discourse which is totally false, that Venezuela allegedly sent, millions of narco trafficking criminals and, according to him, people from mental institutions from Venezuela to the U.S. It is true that there is a very important Venezuelan community, migrant community in the U.S. Precisely because of the economic crisis that Alejandro was alluding to, created during the Maduro government. The vast majority of people that have left Venezuela and have been able to reach the U.S. are people that are trying to make ends meet and try to send money eventually to their families in Venezuela, are people that are looking for work, essentially. Obviously, we cannot discount the fact that a minority of them have been involved in certain crimes or have past or current ties to some sort of criminal activities or organization, but that is a large minority, right? So in that sense, there's this other organization called Tren de Aragua, which is a criminal organization that basically was created and originated in a prison in Venezuela, sorry, in the state of Carabobo, which is a central state. And allegedly, it has at least some of the people linked to that organization have established themselves in the U.S. and have been involved in certain crimes. But I have to be very emphatic in the sense that it's a minority, and the vast majority of Venezuelans in the U.S. are hardworking people that are trying to find a way forward after having had to leave very dire and difficult economic circumstances mainly, but also in some cases political persecution circumstances in Venezuela. So if you take all that, that leaves you in that from a legal standpoint, it is very hard to give cover to the operation and to the decision to get rid of Maduro in power. But at the end, we also know that as I said before, the U.S. Government also had some arguments to basically convince some people in Congress, although not formally, but also some people I think more importantly, it was important for the Trump administration to try to offer some cover to the military involved in all these activities. And that's why, for example, we saw recently, late last year, that the State Department designated Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist. That's how everything explains, right?
Mhm.
That being said, I think I also have to briefly respond to the second question, which is the present, right? I think from an international perspective, this present is worrying because if you see the U.S. national security strategy, which was published late last year, it seems that the Trump administration has this objective of trying to put again its attention in the Western Hemisphere, but mostly through a strategy of coercion and threats, which sometimes it's useful in international relations, and many countries do this. But I think that historically, what has united somehow, not only culturally, but more from a value perspective, the Americas with the US, is values. And those values are basically democracy and human rights. What seems to be happening is that the Trump administration has this strategy which they want to see the world under a logic of spheres of influence, and they want to basically reclaim their preeminence in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, through this, coercion and threats. And to that end, obviously, what happened, the successful from a U.S. military standpoint, extraction of Nicolas Maduro is very helpful because it has really demonstrated that the threats set by Trump could become a reality for not only for Venezuela but for other countries in the region. So that's why we have seen, the government in Mexico being very careful about how to manage their relation with Trump, making some important concessions. We're also seeing that, there was a really tense relationship with the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. They recently, in the last couple of days, Trump and Gustavo Petro had a phone call. They are trying to manage that situation, but we are now moving into to a scenario in which the U.S. is going to try to take advantage of the success of the operation against Maduro to basically to try to coerce not only the Latin American region, but perhaps other countries in the world, and also the Venezuelan government that was able to stay in power, which, as Alejandro said, is basically the same one that was minus Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores, who was a very important political operator in Venezuela. I do not foresee that the region, nor even other countries or other group of countries, like for example the European Union, have many tools, many leverage at the present moment to push back against what we have seen, what has happened. But I do think that given that this precedent, perhaps not in the short term, but in the medium and long term, there's going to start to be some movements in the region, in Europe and in other areas of the world, basically to try to cover themselves or decrease the risk that the U.S. can advance this foreign policy agenda of trying to impose themselves. So I'm not hopeful in the short term, but I do think that this idea that the U.S. can really dominate at least the Western Hemisphere only by threats and coercion, I don't think in the ultimate case it's going to really work. The U.S. should also be thinking about incentives, positive incentives, what we also called in international relation carrots, and that basically is very much tied to the situation in Venezuela, because now we have President Trump saying that this is all about oil, and now the U.S. is going to recover the Venezuelan oil industry, with the little problem that President Trump cannot really force or direct big oil U.S. companies to do massive investments in Venezuela and really recover the oil industry, unless the real problem in the country gets resolved, which is you establish a rule of law, you make substantial investments to recover the infrastructure of the country, you have independent courts that basically guarantee the respect of contracts. I am very skeptic about whether this plan of President Trump is going to work, but at the same time, I understand why he decided to leave the Maduro regime in place, because the possibility of advancing these oil deals, which basically would minimize the interest of the Venezuelan people, is much more likely if you have in power in Venezuela an authoritarian government that does not have to answer, that has decades of not answering to the interest of the Venezuelan people. So I would leave it at that, and we'll continue in the questions.
Okay, so I just want to go to the next panelist, and then we'll just go through all the questions because there's a lot of them. So I want to welcome Roxana Vigil. She's an international affairs and national security expert who has worked on U.S. policy toward Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. Roxana, can you please focus your remarks on the U.S. side of this moment? The United States has taken extraordinary steps in Venezuela, but official goals beyond transition remain vague, even though Secretary of State Marco Rubio talked yesterday about a three-step process. They have also said it can take a long time. We don't know when elections are going to be, etc. And the other question is, how should journalists understand the current objectives of U.S. policy towards Venezuela at this stage? What is Washington trying to achieve, and why now?
Yeah, so thank you, Pilar, for having me, and it's an honor to be here with Alejandro and Mariano. So, I think that I'll focus first on this oil objective, because even though Secretary Rubio has outlined this three-phase plan, we haven't heard President Trump mention anything about a democratic transition. So in my view, because it's been made very clear that President Trump is the one calling the shots, until we hear President Trump articulate some policy or some support for a transition, my sense is that that is not going to be a actual part of the plan. So on the oil side, you have Venezuela producing about 900,000 barrels of oil per day. Big picture for the global supply, that's less than 1% of global supply. So in sort of the global scale, it's quite a small amount. But of course, Venezuela's economy is almost completely dependent on oil revenues. So that impacts Venezuela a lot. I agree with some of what Mariano was saying, which is, in order to achieve President Trump's objective of rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector, you need a few things. For one, you need new laws, a new economic framework, essentially institutional changes, structural changes that can really only be done by a democratically elected government. And then two, you need the investment. Those, the rule of law, those structural institutional changes are going to give investors confidence that their investment will be secure. And we have President Trump saying just yesterday or 2 days ago that the type of investment he has in mind is $100 billion, which indicates, this multi-year effort. That doesn't square up or doesn't match up with the big picture, the big global oil picture, which is the market is very well supplied right now. You have non-OPEC oil production that's going to be coming from the Americas, which the International Energy Agency refers to as the Americas Quintet. That's the United States, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Guyana. These countries are going to be adding supply to the market. And I think in the coming years, what you're going to see is an oversupply of oil. So the world, just in practical terms, does not need more, and certainly the United States does not need more Venezuelan oil, which is a very specific type of oil. It's heavy, it's sour, it requires significant inputs in order to get it into a state that it can be moved, and then it requires refining. And to refine Venezuelan oil, you need a very specific type of refinery. So there are only a few, like there are specific refineries around the world that can even accept Venezuelan oil to refine it and turn it into a product that can be used. So, that's another aspect why it's this a larger objective of rebuilding Venezuela's energy sector over this multi-year, really a decade-long commitment that would be needed, doesn't match up with sort of the reality. And then I want to turn really quickly to the sanctions aspect of this. So Venezuela is under a very complicated sanctions program. And I can take questions on specifics later on, but sort of big picture is you have the entire government of Venezuela that has been blocked as part of the US sanctions program. You also have the Venezuelan energy sector, the oil sector, that is under sanctions, and you have Venezuela's financial sector under sanctions. So what I would expect to see, if the objective was to meaningfully and substantially rebuild the oil sector, invite investors in, and maybe this is something that is coming but has not been articulated yet, is a clear signal to the market, especially to the investors and the oil companies that the administration is trying to attract, that sanctions are not going to get in their way. And there are different ways to do that. There's like different ways to slice it, but it could be through some sort of lifting of sanctions or suspension of sanctions, or some general authorizations, basically blanket carve-outs for U.S. persons to be able to not have to abide by the restrictions. And what the market would be looking for would be some sign of a long-term sanctions waiver commitment. Not something short-term, because again, these are really large investments, really long-term investments. So far, we haven't seen any of that. So far, what we have is the Secretary of Energy indicating a few really important things. One, that the US government is going to indefinitely be selling Venezuelan oil. Another thing that the Department of Energy has announced is that there are going to be authorizations for selling the oil and for dealing with the proceeds, and I'll get into that in a second. But no details. Are these the U.S. government, through the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, does have a mechanism through which they can issue private authorizations. So these are authorizations for a single company to do a certain transaction or a certain deal or a certain set of transactions. That might be the route that they're going. It's not clear. And so I think that'll be an important piece of this puzzle to see where things are going. And then the two really quick things. I want to just mention the blockade. So President Trump has made clear that the blockade, which is being enforced by the naval deployment off the coast of Venezuela, will remain in place. The blockade is meant to enforce the oil sector sanctions and really target these the shadow fleet, which is essentially a set of hundreds of vessels that transport not just Venezuelan, but they transport Venezuelan oil, Iranian oil, and Russian oil around the world on the black market. And they sell the oil at a discount because the buyers are taking a big risk by dealing with sanctioned oil. So you have the black market, this shadow fleet selling Venezuelan oil and oil from other sanctioned countries. And the Trump administration, for the first time that I'm aware of, is using the military to enforce US sanctions and target the shadow fleet. That raises a whole other set of questions, but related to just the specific blockade, I think we need to see what's going to happen to the blockade, whether the military force will stay there just to enforce the blockade and also add pressure onto the regime, what that means for, is 100% of the oil going to start going to the US? That's certainly what it sounds like. And what does that mean for sort of Venezuela's commitments with some of its other partners in the oil sector? And then finally, I want to mention the questions that I have, or the concerns that I have related to although we have very little information about how the Trump administration plans to use the proceeds of oil and what they plan to do. But what they've said so far, which is very little, is that it is not going to go to the Treasury Department. It is not going to be part of the funds that have oversight and controls that would normally be part of government funds. So far, what's been indicated is that the proceeds of the oil, Venezuelan oil that the U.S. government sells, is going to settle in a U.S. account, unclear where. And there's also been reporting that the money will, it's unclear where in sort of the transaction, will be in offshore accounts, which of course raises a lot of questions about that. And then the final thing is where the money goes, who uses it, what kind of controls are there going to be to make sure that the money doesn't end up sort of being used for corrupt purposes. And one of the two main issues. One, some of the funds I think inevitably will need to go to Delcy Rodriguez in order for her to run the government that she's overseeing now, to the extent that it meets this overarching U.S. objective of oil. So that has sanctions implications, but of course raises other questions. And then this objective, or this what President Trump has said, that the money will benefit the Venezuelan people, sort of going back to what some of the other panelists said. Right now, the Venezuelan people are not being represented at this proverbial table. You have the U.S. government, you have Delcy Rodriguez's government. Who is representing the Venezuelan people to determine how best to use those proceeds to their benefit? So that's an open question in my mind, and I think a big concern. If there is no representative, there's no mechanism for a representative of the Venezuelan people to inform how those funds are used. And I'll stop there.
That's a very good point. And it would be ideal to see the opposition represented, but so far they've been left out of the conversation. Okay, let's start with questions. And any of you that wants to answer the question can just answer. I'm going to start with, okay, there's a question about journalistic terms. I'm going to leave that for the end. There's a question from Carlos Roa, who is a Venezuelan. Also, Carlos, you want to ask your question? The first one? Carlos Roa?
Yes, here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I asked two questions. Would you like me to ask the first or the second?
Whatever you want.
Okay, I have a question for Mariano de Alba. Mariano, President Maduro, or ruler Maduro, as Pilar properly said, was captured on allegations of drug trafficking. But there are reports in the United Nations about horrific violations of human rights. And there is a case in the International Criminal Court against him. Is there a way to present him in front of some justice organization that can work on making him accountable for human rights violations when the operation from the United States was not related to this?
Should I go ahead and quickly answer?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes,
Okay,
try
so,
to be short.
Sure, it's highly unlikely, and I'll tell you why. The most clear setting in which Nicolas Maduro could be eventually tried in an international court that is looking into these human rights violations and potential crimes against humanity is the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has been investigating the potential commission of these crimes since formally investigating since late 2021, but it has not, at least publicly, issued an indictment against any Venezuelan official. So there's still no indictment against Maduro, despite what some people say in the media. It is possible because that's a decision that the International Criminal Court took, especially after the arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu it is possible that the International Criminal Court has or will issue soon an arrest warrant. If it has already been issued, it is confidential, and but that's a decision of the court whether to make it public or not. That being said, I think it's fairly obvious that the relationship between the Trump administration and the International Criminal Court is non-existent. Many people from the International Criminal Court and judges and administrative staffs are even under U.S. sanctions now. So I don't think that the U.S. government will, even if we have an arrest warrant from the ICC against Maduro, I don't think the U.S. at least this U.S. government is going to turn over Maduro to the International Criminal Court. So I think that in the short, medium term, Maduro is going to be tried before U.S. courts, and we'll have to see what happens there.
There's a couple of questions also, Mariano, about what legal consequences could the U.S. face for this attack or kidnapping or whatever people want to call it.
I mean, I think that from an international perspective, it's highly unlikely that they will face any legal consequence. There's a possibility that the fact that this attack was authorized will eventually be tried before U.S. courts. But as we know, the attack was ordered by President Trump. We know that the position that the U.S. Supreme Court has taken about immunity of sitting presidents and the decisions that they have taken while sitting in the White House. So I think that it's highly unlikely that the U.S., Trump, or any official will eventually face any sort of legal consequences because of what happened.
Okay, let's see. Nancy Tran, do you want to ask your question about China? Nancy Tran.
Yeah, hi. I know that. Do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, my question is as some of these things that Trump tried to control oil so that he can choke off China's supply of oil. But I heard that China's oil from Venezuela to China is only like 5% of its demand. So I don't know how much does it affect the oil supply to China.
Does anyone know? Roxana, Alejandro?
I'm happy to just provide. Yeah, the China argument doesn't add up for two reasons. One, China is one of the few places that can refine this very heavy sour type of crude that Venezuela has. So in a scenario where you have a significant increase in Venezuelan production and Venezuelan exports, and it's put on the market, some of it is going to end up going to China. And then the other piece of this is China is a really significant bilateral creditor of Venezuela. Venezuela owes China, there's estimates, but let's say over $10 billion. I've seen estimates that are greater. So at some point, whether China's part of a restructuring of Venezuela's debt, which would also need to happen to rebuild Venezuela's oil sector at some point, more of a medium-term thing, China will need to be repaid at some point. So my sense is China's broader interests are getting repaid.
Yeah, and I know that China loaned Venezuela a lot of money over the years. Okay, there's a couple of questions here regarding the reaction of Venezuelans. Rebecca, I'm going to read questions just because we have very few minutes left. From Rebecca Bartos, is this intervention reshaping Venezuelan perceptions of the U.S. and Trump, particularly in light of his anti-immigrant rhetoric? Do you see political alignments shifting in terms of Latin America's support for Trump? Alejandro, what can you tell us about the reaction of Venezuelans inside and outside of this historic moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I should preface anything by saying it's varied, right? So to speak in vocal terms about the opposition or Venezuelans broadly would be a mistake. But there are some common threads you can find. I think there is extremely very little love lost for Maduro being out. I think that the primary sort of axis of contention right now is, at least from the folks that I speak with, about the manner in which it happened, right? Which is an armed assault on Venezuelan territory, which we should note killed as many as 100 people. Many of them, of course, security guards securing Nicolas Maduro, many of those Cuban intelligence officials. But there's a question about whether or not this threat of additional pressure, which might be military in nature, could then parlay into other attacks, right? So part of the tension now is we support the ouster of Maduro, but we are either, ranges from concern to opposition of the actual intervention by the United States. Abroad, that dynamic is slightly different. I think abroad, the overwhelming sense is, and Mariano and Rosana can speak to their own experiences, especially from an expatriate community that's been around abroad for longer than just, say, this last 5 or 10 years, which is marked by a different type of migratory wave. It's actually disappointment. It's disappointment that this thing that many had been in some ways hoping for, which is in fact U.S. intervention that leads to the fall of the Maduro government, has led to the fall of Maduro, but not the government. And in addition, it has not only left in place the entire state apparatus, but with apparent, support by the Trump administration, which, especially the Maria Corina wing of the opposition, has long been courting, going back all the way to the first Trump administration. So there's the kind of confusion that I was talking about before. I think is also pervasive among Venezuelans, both inside and outside.
Okay, we have only 3 minutes left. So this is a question for all of you. If the goal is or should be, I think most Venezuelans would agree that the goal should be a democratic Venezuela that governs itself. What is the single most important thing the United States should do or avoid doing in the next few months? Alejandro, go ahead, and then Mariano and Roxana.
Okay. I think the most important thing that the U.S. government should do to support that outcome is to stop speaking as though it owns Venezuela, right? I mean, you can't in the same breath say, yeah, of course, we want to see a democratic transition, although as Mariano suggested, Trump has not said that at all. In his press conference on Saturday morning, the word democracy didn't come up once. Right. And yes, Marco Rubio has indicated it is part of a 3-point plan. But again, as Mariana suggested, if that is part of Trump's vision, it's unclear if he's going to articulate it. So I think the very first thing that the U.S. has to do is to stop suggesting that it runs Venezuela, that it's going to seize all of Venezuela's oil, that it's essentially going to oversee Venezuela either directly or indirectly through threat of force. Nothing else can happen. The part of the U.S. influence there, if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, Mariano. Sorry, Mariano.
Sure. Well, I don't know if we can really expect this from the Trump administration, but I would say that it is really important to think long term. I think that obviously there's an issue here about what are the interests of Venezuelans. That is not only democracy and a sustainable solution, but I would also say that it is a solution or a way forward that really allows Venezuela to recover from an economic standpoint. So I think that what I'm seeing right now is a U.S. government that is rightly so putting front and center their interest, but minimizing to the extreme also the interest of the Venezuelan people who are the people that in ultimate case can really recover this country and move it forward in terms of not only solid institutions that can make the country stable, but also from an economic standpoint. So I think that should be the priority. But to be honest, I don't have a lot of hope that that will be the case, at least in the short term.
Neither do I, Roxana.
I mean, yeah, just to echo some of the same things, I think unless we see some clear policy statement from President Trump indicating that the Trump administration has a plan for a transition to democracy, I would say, you know, in the short term, in the next few months, then I don't see how it could meet its objective of rebuilding the oil sector, which then calls into question what is the objective here that hasn't been said. And then the last thing is in order for this fund, the proceeds of oil, the oil that the U.S. government is taking from Venezuela, in order for those funds to not fall into corruption, to not sort of which history tells us these type of programs end up falling into, you would need an independent third party to control the funds and the distribution of the funds. So you know, that would be another aspect that I think you would need to see in order for the Venezuelan people to benefit. And then, of course, them having a seat at the table.
Thank you so much. It's 1 minute past, so we're going to close, but with the last message of please continue doing your work of finding out more about Venezuela and keep Venezuelans in mind. It's not just about ideology. It's about a whole country of people that have been essentially suffering for 27 years under a dictatorship. And we all want to see Venezuela as a democracy. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time. Thank you. Thank you to the